one of the topics that's going to be coming up fairly shortly is artificial intelligence and music. And I thought I'd take the time to look at the history of music itself and recorded music in any fashion or form, because you can't do this discussion of AI until you understand the history of music itself. And so what I've done is I've put out a board here to start looking at this, because in a few weeks we're going to have the new Beatles album by Paul McCartney with the new tracks, and we're going to see potentially the use of John Lennon's voice in it as well. And there's a lot of fluff and a lot of unconstructive arguments about it. If you're a type of reader, I highly recommend the article that was just done by the BBC on music from the dead, essentially. And but before we go back to that, I want to go through the history of music itself. And up until 650 AD, the music that was created by any person up to that point died with them. There was no way of essentially transcribing it. It was, I kind of remember the tune sort of thing, and it had to be passed on word of mouth. And so in 650 AD, this first sheet music appeared. And, well, we had a kind of a tour through history, but in 1796, the Symphonia was created, which is the first beginnings of mechanical reproduction of music. The Symphonias are essentially gigantic music boxes with, rather than having 6 or 7 little prongs, they had hundreds of them. They're absolutely gorgeous if you ever get to hear one. About 100 years later, we have the first of recording by Charles Crow and also Edison. They essentially, without the knowledge that the other was working on that project, essentially came up with the same way of trying to record music itself. So now we've gone from sheet music to a mechanical reproduction of a tune, but now we're starting to record the actual artist. And this is a huge change. And in 1887, we actually have the gramophone, which is pretty much kind of the precursor to what a lot of us have lived with for a long, long time. So we're talking about the music itself is written down. We now have recordings of the artists actually doing it. So we have the preservation of the work by the artists themselves as they wish it to be recorded. So we have personal involvement and decision making in what is recorded and how it's recorded, so to speak. In the 1920s, we have radio appear on the scene, and now we have these methods being used to broadcast it to the many. And so tunes start becoming popular, they start becoming faddish, but a whole world can enjoy what was recorded from the radio. Limited in ability to choose at your home, you know, what recording you listen to, but you had the radio. I bring television in here in 1927. I'm not sure that's when they actually started broadcasting anything with music, or maybe little jingles and tunes came along in the 30s or something, but not many people really got to experience it. But television now merges the image of the artist with the music. So now they become recognizable. Certainly through this period, photography was the main way that you would actually get to see the artist, but you wouldn't see him and actually hear the performance at the same time. You had to go to the dance halls and everything else. But as things progressed, eventually someone came along who put it all together under one format, and that was Lawrence Welk, with all the tunes of before, and anyone of my age group, and perhaps a little bit older, can remember being tortured by having to listen to Lawrence Welk every Saturday night. But I think it's worth mentioning, that now we start seeing live musical performances, or at least well recorded. In 1966, the CD is out there and available. We really see the commercial use of it in 1982. Now, I put off here to the side 1978 because we have optical recordings, and so we have disco vision. So now we're starting to see maybe we can record live performances and store them on a disc. So we had the merge of video and audio at the same time. 1983, we have the internet. We have Napster really coming to the fore in 1999. Their problem was they were willing to distribute music but not pay the artist for it. And that got blown up, and Stephen Jobs recognized that if I just pay the artist, give him something, I'll get all the music, and ta-da, iTunes. And around that time, you also had the first live streaming in 1995 of a musical performance. 2005, you have YouTube that really starts opening up the world to more musicians if they can't get on major recording labels or even filmed. This gives them an out. Blu-ray comes along in 2006. But you see this little star, and it comes down here, the seed in 1991 of essentially AI. Because here we had Natalie Cole sing to a video by her father, Nat King Cole, of doing Unforgettable. And this is really the beginning seed of what are the potentials of combining an artist who no longer exists in physical form, he exists in maybe video or music or recorded form, with a live performance. So this is really the seed right here. Now, a lot of people are deeply concerned about AI, some people calling it progress. Now, the use of progress, that term is, in America, is usually noting that things are moving ahead or getting better. And if you look at all of these steps, it's essentially not progress, it's change. And change is really the key word. Development would be another good term for that. Developments can be good, they can be bad, they can be short-lived. It's kind of like genealogy, that maybe there's an offshoot, but it really doesn't progress very well and dies its own death. So you have to look at artificial intelligence in music very, very carefully. Is it another means of music? Absolutely. I'm not sure that I would want to listen to a band that no longer exists again because they were then, and that music style is passé, and let's move on. There's some artists, and I would be happy not to hear them again at all. And we all have our favorites of who we would like to hear. But what happens with AI is two really critical issues. The first is that whatever music is performed is selected by the musician and say, I really want to do this, or maybe the record label, whatever, pushes them into performing that piece of work. That was true with Paul Revere and the Raiders. They got pushed into performing certain songs they would prefer to have been given others written by other people. So they became known as kind of a drug-free band, when in fact, that may have been partially true, but not completely. But the musicians themselves had a choice in the selection of what was performed, and to a large degree, how it was performed. With the introduction of AI, that type of decision-making is by the artists themselves is lost. And the first question I raise along that line is, who has the right to make the decision of what artists that no longer exist, that is, substituted by AI, who has the decision-making power of what music is actually performed? Because a lot of these steps, whether it was, that time, or, LPs or CDs or, Blu-ray or whatever, the artist usually signs off that you have a right to use my performance. But there's no consideration that your voice or the sound of your voice in the contract could be used other ways. Because the concept of artificially recreating their voice was just not there. So, who gets to make the decision? Now, usually under contract law, if it's not specifically precluded, it's included, although there's some arguments converse to that. If it's not specifically stated, then you don't have the right to it. But it raises a lot of legal questions from the standpoint of who has the right to use that artist's name or voice or image, so to speak. And then we'll take it to the next problem, is that oftentimes artists would choose a style of music or the type of songs which were messages that they wanted to share or they felt were worth sharing. And with the advent of AI, the question becomes even more alarming to me, is the use of their likeness, or more importantly, their voice, for issues or things or topics that are completely contrary to what they personally believed. And so we get this kind of smearing of, how should we say, the reputation that person established of who they were. I'm not sure that I would want to hear John Lennon's voice used in gangster rap. That's not who he was personally, certainly not his style of music, but AI opens up the opportunity for doing just that. And so you really have to look at the AI question as a development, but the responsibility of how that is used remains open. And unfortunately, the music industry itself has a long, well-established history of doing things for profit in total disregard of anything else. We can start out with the radio stations and the pay to play, which developed into distributing drugs and everything else, so you could get your record on the air and see if it would run. And they're not the people who are in charge of producing or recording the music. They're very different than the artists themselves. And that to me is the question about the use of AI. I'm not opposed to it. It's a development. It falls into the stream of how things are developing. But as I said, there's two basic questions that remain as to the type of music that their voice or even image is used on, as well as the message that's included within the music itself. So do take the time to read up on how this is developing. We can only sit back and watch and see how it starts out. And I'm sure a couple of the issues, and I'm sure others that I didn't talk about, are going to come up, and they're legitimate questions.